All right, so finally, I get a chance to finish this. So basically, what's going to happen, and this is kind of again backs up a little bit to right before the end of World War II. By 1944, that we know it's going to be over, right? I mean, maybe Germany doesn't want to admit it's over. Maybe Japan doesn't want to admit it's over, but really, I mean, the signs are there that it would take a miracle, a major development for Germany or Japan to come back. And Italy's already out of the picture. And so what you're going to see is that by 1944, that this idea comes together that, and it's dominated by the Allies, of course, that what we're going to do is create a national organization, or not national, international organization to achieve peace, right? Or at least achieve cooperation. And part of this is not just about preventing war, it's about reaching agreements on trade and handling border disputes and civil rights violations. So the concept of the United Nations is really meant to address all of the things that were emerging as major problems in the 1930s. And if you think about FDR, and if you think about his belief that international trade, that business partners are less likely to fight with each other, you definitely see kind of that impact there. So what will happen is that they basically create this international organization called the UN. Brief description of how the UN works, because many people don't realize this. You've got a General Assembly where all countries that belong to the UN have a vote, right? They vote on resolutions, so like if the UN wants to condemn a particular action or something like that, then they can vote on those. They also vote on the budget, so you can see it's very much similar to kind of like the House of Representatives. So they choose where the money goes. But you're also going to see that there's a certain number of Security Council people. The Security Council are a primary group of strong leaders, and 6 of them rotate based on votes from the General Assembly. There's 5 permanent ones, and see if this doesn't sound familiar. The U.S., Great Britain, Soviet Union, China, and France. All of these were the Allies, and they are able to. The United Nations cannot act as a group unless the Security Council is unanimous. So this will be particularly important when we talk about Korea. Because Korea is a United Nations action. It was also particularly important in the first Gulf War. That's a United Nations action. And these are things that require the participation and the compliance of the Security Council. And so it's very important, and it's not just dominated by the United States, because you've got all these other members. But it definitely, the Security Council is definitely the main kind of governing arm of the UN. And it'll be very important when we talk about Korea, because China, of course, remember the United States liked the nationalist Chinese, not the communist Chinese. Well, with the Cold War emerging in the late 1940s and 1950s, the United States has no interest in recognizing the communist Chinese. So initially, in the early 50s, they refused to let the communist Chinese, the ones who control the majority of China, have the seat on the Security Council. And of course, the nationalist Chinese that are kind of isolated over in Taiwan, they're going to go with whatever the United States says. So this is a big part of why the Korean War happens the way it does. And so you're going to have this overall charter of world peace and security. And again, this has a strong economic component as well as a military component. So it's not just one or the other. The next thing that you're going to see happening, it's important that you realize that the entire world recognizes that the kind of genocide, the kind of treatment of prisoners of war that the Germans and the Japanese engaged in, that's not acceptable, right? So the United States kind of takes the lead there, and they hold international military tribunals. They prosecute Germans based on war crimes. They also do the same thing for the Far East. try some of the Japanese leaders. They don't execute nearly as many of the Japanese leaders and punish nearly as many, but you do certainly see that that there is an attempt to tell the world, okay, we're not going to do this again. Now, one could argue that, maybe that's not, whether or not that's been completely successful, I don't know. And certainly this is why things like Guantanamo Bay are a big deal, right? Because the U.S., takes this stance that we have a right to tell people or tell countries what's acceptable and what's not, unless, of course, it's our national security, right? And so that's a very important part of it. And again, remember that we tend to be much nicer towards the Japanese, really, and this is a picture from the Nuremberg trials. We tend to be much nicer to the Japanese because we want to have that kind of position. We want to have an ally in the Pacific, especially close to the Soviet Union. The other thing I want to mention is understand that in China, that you have after World War II, you have another tug of war, basically between the Communist Chinese and the Nationalist Chinese. And the Communist Chinese, basically because they were the ones that effectively fought the Japanese, they were not nearly as corrupt as the Nationalist Chinese. They're going to very, very soon get control over mainland China. And what's going to happen is that the Nationalist Chinese are going to kind of get pushed off to the little bitty island of Taiwan. So that's kind of the origin of Taiwan. That's why there can occasionally be tensions between China and Taiwan now. This is why Taiwan has such a close relationship with the United States, because like I said, for a long time, the U.S. tried to say, oh, no, China is really dominated by the Taiwanese. And, of course, eventually we back off of that. But so I think it's important to understand and then recognize that this is also part of why there's going to be a cultural revolution in China. And I don't mean that in a good way. The Cultural Revolution is really a period of oppression and throwing people in jail. It's kind of like a purge of influence. This is one of the reasons why the U.S. and China for so long did not have very good relations. Now, obviously, and we'll talk about how Nixon kind of eased those tensions. And so now we have a very different relationship with China. But that's kind of the backstory there, and I wanted to be sure and touch on that because when we get to talking about the Cold War, and we start talking about especially the concern in Southeast Asia that communism was going to spread, you have to understand that China is over there, and that China is map of Southeast Asia. That China is really perceived, especially going into the 1950s, right? It's perceived as kind of this, kind of the reason for why communism is becoming such a threat in this area. And you can see right here, of course, this shows you Taiwan, right? So when I say that they pushed the national, this is how unpopular the nationalist Chinese were. They went to this little bitty island. So here's mainland China. Now, remember that Japan is up here, so the Soviet Union's going to be farther up here. And of course, the Soviet Union spreads through all of that. But you can see the proximity of China to Vietnam, to Australia, to India, those kind of places, right? So when the U.S. starts to get very nervous about the spread of China, the spread of communism, especially when you're talking about South Vietnam, then you've got Korea. Let's see, Korea is sitting right over here. No, Korea is farther up. I'm sorry. That's part of China. Korea is right up here. So part of the reason why we're so nervous about Chinese influence is because they're dominated by communists. So understand that World War II basically is the foundation of the world that we know. Middle Eastern relationships get their foundation because of the creation of Israel. Israel's kind of basically willed into being thanks to the United Nations and the United States and Great Britain. And very quickly in 1948, you're going to have Israel having to fight for its independence. You're going to have the U.S. seriously backing Israel. That's going to create tensions going into the 1960s and 1970s, ultimately with the Yom Kippur War and the U.S. support leading to the Iranian hostage crisis and the OPEC oil embargo. You're going to see that the foundation for Iran and for the Iranian hostage crisis goes back to the Cold War in the Middle East and the concern of the influence of the Soviet Union on Iran. So, like, when you consider how incredibly important the Middle East has been to us in the 21st century, thanks to 9/11, you can definitely see that World War II lays this foundation. And what's interesting is it lays the foundation really because of the mindset. And this is one of the things that we'll talk about. We're going to touch on it a little bit looking at some of the speeches from World War II, but we'll develop this a little bit more when we get to the Cold War. This idea that, you know, this idea that the U.S. has to somehow protect democracy, and that the U.S. sees itself as kind of like a caretaker, right? And this is a really powerful idea that continues to shape our foreign policy today. And this comes from this period. The United States and the Soviet Union have incredible tensions all throughout, from the 50s to the 90s. Some would argue that we have tensions again, thanks to Vladimir Putin. These tensions shape U.S. defense spending, U.S. social policy, creates technology. It does all kinds of things, the space race. I could go on and on. So this relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union is incredibly important, which is part of why we've talked going back into World War I, talking about the Bolshevik Revolution, having kind of a functioning understanding of communism going into what is essentially World War II and coming out of that. So be sure that you understand this, and we'll talk more about the influence of the Cold War. And of course, atomic supremacy is incredibly important. And we have some real prevailing questions here about, the United Nations. And I don't know that we really have complete answers on that, to tell you the honest truth. I added, if you're looking at the PowerPoint itself, this isn't on here, but actually it would be on there. I take that back. So I wanted to include just a little bit because I had mentioned the Yalta Conference. So this is the last picture that we have of FDR. You can see how frail he looks. You've got Stalin, you've got Churchill. Yalta is around Iceland, I think it is, so obviously it's very cold. That's why they're all in these heavy jackets. And so the Yalta Conference is the one where we're going to have these key agreements about Eastern Europe, that basically the U.S. and Great Britain say, okay, we'll let communist parties run on the ticket, right? But they have to have, they basically have to have these elections, right? And so you're going to see that that in this part of 1945, while the Manhattan Project is going, we don't have the successful test of an atomic weapon. And so having this agreement with the Soviet Union, allowing for communism to be a viable option in these possible European countries. Now, the problem will be that the Soviet Union will not back out of the areas. And so if you look at, and I've got a map coming up here in a second, but if you look at these areas that, that Soviet Union had swept into and pushing back the Germans away from Moscow, they don't let go of those territories, right? Those territories stay under Russian control. Now, they may not officially be annexed by Russia, but it's very much that kind of protectorate mindset. And remember way back at the beginning of all of this when I talked about that communism, particularly Soviet communism, has this kind of very defensive, very paranoid kind of posture that really strongly believes in this idea of a buffer zone. And that's absolutely what they're trying to do. Yes, this does create hegemony. This creates economic control. It creates military control. It creates social control. At the end of the day, though, it's all meant to insulate the Soviet Union from outside influence. And so I think it's very important for you to kind of grasp that. And so you have this notion of Yalta, so you want to be sure you're aware of that. Potsdam Conference, of course, this is going to be this is after the end of the war in Europe, but before the end of the war in the Pacific. You're going to see Churchill, Stalin, and Truman. Again, Stalin and Truman didn't really care for each other a whole lot. This is where they start making their final plans, especially going over issues of Germany and like how they're going to split up Germany. If you remember way back, I think it was the Tehran Conference, They agreed that they would divide Germany and so that it couldn't become a unified power again. But now they're going to refine all of that in the Potsdam Conference. And you're going to have one of the issues that's going to pop up later is going to be this issue of reparations. Stalin wants reparation payments from Germany. And of course, the U.S. is not going to make the mistake that they made in World War I when Wilson kind of backed off of that idea. And so Truman sticks to his guns and he says, no, you can't have reparation payments. That's counter to what we're doing here. And that's part of what led us into the whole war in the first place. And he basically sticks to his guns on that. And this is kind of where there's this kind of back and forth over the testing of the atomic bomb. What all did Truman say? And it does suggest that Truman did kind of let Stalin know that, we're working on this weapon. The interesting part, though, is that the Soviet Union actually was somewhat aware of it. You already had spies leaking information about the atomic bomb. So regardless of to what extent Truman revealed the atomic bomb, Stalin knew it was there, right? And so he's just not wanting to comply. He's wanting to get that agreement on the reparation payments. And so you're going to see that this is kind of the beginning of those tensions with the Soviet Union that's going to lead us into the Cold War. Now, this is a map of the partitioning of Germany. This is what they come up with in the Potsdam Conference. And you can see here's Poland and Czechoslovakia. So those areas the Russians have swept over. They actually kind of control this whole section. So these areas, this here area in red, and then Poland and Czechoslovakia, are going to be under the control of the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, Poland and Czechoslovakia are not part of Germany, so they maintain kind of their national unity, even though they're being dominated by the Soviets. What's interesting is that this section here does fall under the control of the Soviet Union. They partition it, right? You've got a Soviet zone, a British zone, a French zone, and an American zone. And so this is going to be a huge issue eventually when the French, the British, and the Americans unify their partitions into West Germany, and that's going to help trigger the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. Understand that Berlin itself is divided into four as well. And so, this is where we get the East and West concept from. And so you're going to want to have kind of a functional understanding of the partitioning of Germany and kind of what that looked like. And then understand that eventually this section will become West Germany and this will be East Germany. And that Berlin is divided in two because that's part of kind of the Cold War backstory. So I wanted to be sure that you knew what that looked like. And this kind of runs through kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. You're going to see that we have, this thing called the Iron Curtain that Churchill's going to peg this as, that kind of this control of the Soviet Union over these areas in Eastern Europe, and that you really have this split between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And so we'll kind of be revisiting all of this stuff, but I wanted to just throw it out there. And again, we're going to see that whether it's the Berlin airlift, whether we're talking about the creation of NATO or whatever, things like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. Of course, the Marshall Plan is going to be orchestrated by George Marshall, and this is going to be a way to rebuild Europe. And again, all of this is about kind of this relationship with the Soviet Union that's really started to turn sour because it's all about this competition. It's all about this sort of thing. You're going to be very familiar with NSC 68. The Cold War is incredibly important for the second half of 1302, and again, it's very important as far as the STAR test is concerned. So I'm going to stop here, and this will be it for World War II. At some point, we'll be taking a quiz, and hopefully you've looked at the notes and you're doing that, and we'll be looking at the documents in class.